Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Steve Young brings more than 20 years of clinical research experience to his role as Senior Director of Transformation Services at Omnicom Systems. Prior to joining Omnicom, Steve led the development of Metadata's insights and site monitoring solution portfolios and provided risk-based monitoring consultation to numerous customers. He led a pivotal SDV analysis in collaboration with Transcelerate and co-authored an article with them in DIA Journal presenting the results. Steve previously spent a number of years in clinical data management leadership positions where he successfully led the enterprise rollout of EDC at both J&J and CentralCore. And our second speaker for today, Andy Lawton, has extensive experience in computing, statistics, data management, RDE, RDC, system design, RBA, and CSV in clinical trials. He's previously worked with Seismic Exploration and National Health Service and is currently at Boehringer Ingelheim. He became the Global Head of Clinical Data Management in 2013. This is a new strategic role within Boehringer Ingelheim, responsible for SOPs, governance of processes and systems, and new initiatives in the CDM area. Beyond that, Andy is a founding committee member of ACDM, member of Transcelerate RBM Workstream, and a member of the EFPIA Working Group on Data Transparency. His most notable publication is the paper with Dr. Alistair Ross on GP audit throughout the 80s and 90s. This was the most quoted paper in the BMJ. All right, well, without further ado, I would like to hand the mic over to Steve Young. Steve, you can begin your presentation when ready.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you, all of you, for joining our webinar today and taking time out of your busy schedules. We expect and we hope this will be a very informative webinar for you. I'd just like to say up front that it's really a privilege for us to have Andy Lawton joining us for this webinar as well. Andy, I've known for several years now and interacted with him on particularly on the risk-based monitoring front. He's been a true pioneer and champion for risk-based monitoring for a long time in the industry. So Andy, thank you very much for joining us and contributing to this. You know, this is going to be very, very conversational. We don't have a separate set of slides for Andy and myself. I'll be talking to each slide, and then Andy will contribute as well. So we'll make it very conversational between us as we go through the slides, and we plan to leave ample time at the end for answering your questions as well. So a couple of key areas that we're going to cover. First, we're going to present some information that really goes over and reinforces the ever-growing case for risk-based monitoring for the industry and for your organizations. And then what we want to talk about is go over key RBM keys or RBM keys to success, and really talk about some of the barriers too and some of the challenges that organizations may be facing with initial adoption efforts, and then really address that and talk about you know, some guidance on how to be successful, and really with a theme, as you can see, of keeping it simple. So before we jump into our content, though, we'd actually like to get some feedback interactively from you. So we have a couple of polling questions. The first one is related to level of RBM adoption, and I'm going to hand it back to Andrew for that.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve. That sounds good. We certainly do have a polling question here appearing on audience member screens right now, and you can vote on this in real time by clicking on your screen. I encourage you to do so right now. The question we have for you: which one of the following best describes your organization's current level of RBM adoption? Your options are fully implementing, so most new studies are expected to use RBM. Another option, piloting. One or more initial stages are using RBM. Actively planning. First use of RBM is expected this year. Exploring, another option there. Definite RBM interest in gathering information at this point. And your final option, no current plans right now. RBM not a current priority? All right, that question again, which one of the following best describes your organization's current level of RBM adoption? Looks like most of you have voted at this point. Let's take a look at the results. All right, there we have it. 33% of you said you're actively planning a first use of RBM expected this year. 24% of you said fully implementing. Another 24% said piloting. 17% of you are exploring at this point, and just 2% of you don't have any current plans. All right, well, with that, I will hand back the mic to you.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and very interesting results indeed. I've done similar polls in the past with colleagues and audiences over the past couple of years, and I would say even a year ago you would have seen more heavily responses at the lower end of that. So it's very apparent. I know this is an informal polling here, but you know, it's really a strong indication of what I'm seeing as well, and that is that more and more organizations are getting very serious about RBM adoption and actually actively moving to implement RBM at this point. I think we're going to see, in my view, a real inflection point in adoption this year and over the next couple of years, where you're going to see a real steady increase in RBM adoption. Andy, anything to add to that from your perspective?
Yeah, I just echo what you've said, and it's good to know that it's coming. The ICH E6 addenda is coming, the new version of GCP at the end of next year, where risk-based monitoring is spread throughout it, and so I'm glad to see that everyone's preparing well for that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a great point, Andy. You know, with the ICH adding RBM to the E6 guidance, I would suggest it's really starting to move from a regulatory perspective from a suggestion or recommendation and more into the area of an actual expectation for the industry. Would you agree with that?
Totally. It's not going to be a question of it's a fashion anymore. It's why don't you follow ICH GCP?
Exactly, exactly. So, you know, in terms of the case for risk-based monitoring, and certainly from a very pragmatic perspective, I think a lot of the momentum that's been building over the past 10 years and the increased conversation and interest in RBM has you know, honestly been driven from a financial imperative perspective. As I think all of us are aware, there's been ever-increasing pressures on the industry, on organizations, from a financial perspective, from a business perspective, and a real need for the industry to find more efficient ways to bring promising new products through clinical development to the marketplace. And you know, risk-based monitoring emerged as a paradigm that you know, in addition to improving quality, provided a real opportunity to drive resource efficiency, and particularly in the area of site monitoring and source document verification, as we're aware. At Omnicom, we've actually developed our own quantitative value model, value calculator, to actually model the potential RBM savings across different study designs, and this is just an illustration taken from that calculator that in which we applied the attributes of a sample phase 3 study, and you can see the red bar reflects the potential monitoring resource savings based on certain assumptions. You can see it can be very significant in terms of actual dollar savings as the industry moves forward. But it's not just about resource efficiency. Real business value comes from improved quality too, and for those of us, and I'm sure Andy would agree with this as well, those of us who have been involved with RBM recognize, as the regulators do, that not only will you be able to achieve similar quality with risk-based monitoring as we do with the, you know, I'll call it the old-fashioned approach of you know, frequent site visits and 100% SDV. It actually will yield higher quality ultimately. And that has very significant business implications. Number one, reducing the amount of serious audit findings during regulatory submissions, which can have a very, and often do, I've been directly aware in my years of situations where there's been serious audit findings that have delayed ultimate marketing approval by over a year, in one case 18 months, and in some cases could lead to actual rejection of the marketing submission. So, improved quality, reducing those mitigating those type of scenarios has huge business implications. That's actually what's modeled in this particular illustration. But it impacts even more than that. During trials, poor quality can result in higher attrition rates of patients, the need to extend enrollment windows, losing lots of valuable time in the development timeline. So, it's certainly value for RBM is very significant, and it's across at least these two dimensions. Andy, anything to add there?
Yeah, to me, it's all about the quality, and it's the fact that at present, if you're not doing risk-based monitoring, you're not defining your metrics, you're not defining your standard of quality that you're going to meet. How many studies are we actually defining how many protocol violations we expect, and whether we're going to be within that? Where within risk-based monitoring, we're moving to defining a quality, and then whether we're going to meet that and measuring whether we're going to meet that. And if we don't meet it, explaining it. So we have quality with risk-based monitoring. I'd say currently we don't. And you're going to get that quality at a lower cost.
Absolutely. Yep. And the lower cost is sort of, you could call it icing on the cake, I guess. It's all about
very nice icing.
Quality. It's very nice icing, absolutely. As many of you may already be aware, we've had very strong regulatory endorsements from RBM already. The FDA issued its final guidance on risk-based monitoring back in August 2013, so that's going on close to 2 years now, after they issued the draft guidance back in 2011. And their guidance is not just a passive description of a suggested alternate methodology. It is a ringing endorsement, and I just took you can see a salient quote here that reflects that they are saying indeed that this approach is going to yield higher quality overall. So the FDA and the EMA are not passive on this topic. They're very engaged, and they're really strongly encouraging and recommending industry to adopt a risk-based approach to clinical trials. This again, the EMA issued a reflection paper. Again, similar timeline to FDA. September of 2013 was their final reflection paper, and it's obvious when you read the reflection paper that they're making it a call to action for the industry. And as Andy pointed out, ICH is actively working on adding risk-based monitoring principles to standard GCP guidance as well. Andy, anything else there you wanted to add?
I think the key difference between the EMA and the FDA paper, whether it was something the FDA forgot to put in, but the EMA have clearly come out with this definition of requiring tolerance and error limits, and having that reported in the clinical trial report as part of the quality report. And I think that will be a big boost to quality measurement within the industry, probably improving our review process because we'll be transparent for once.
Exactly. Yes. What a novel idea, right? Okay. So in addition to and following the regulatory, I'm sorry, Andy. Go ahead. Were you going to add something? No, I guess not. Okay. Following the regulatory guidance, Transcelerate, which is an industry consortium, there's at least 20, maybe it's up to 25 now, biopharmaceutical companies as part of this consortium. has provided an excellent framework for methodology support for risk-based monitoring. They incorporated several years ago, and their first order of business as a consortium was indeed risk-based monitoring, which really reflects the importance that they were putting on this paradigm as well. This is just an illustration of some methodology guidance taken from their position paper. Andy, you're an actual active member and key contributor on that. Do you have anything to add there around Transcelerate?
No, visit the website. There's materials on there, and it provides a good framework in which we can build our own risk-based monitoring approaches. You don't have to reinvent the wheel each time, although all our systems mean that we will implement it in slightly different ways.
Right. Excellent. And speaking of Transcelerate, they embarked on a very intensive investigation to better characterize, in particular, the contribution of the practice of source data verification to overall data quality in clinical trials. I actually was recruited by Transcelerate in my former role, and was a key contributor. I oversaw the design approach and oversaw the actual quantitative analysis. That's part of the presentation there. Andy was also a very key contributor and thought leader in the investigation and the approach that we took. This illustration is taken directly from the publication, the DIA journal. It was actually published in DIA journal in November of last year, in their November issue. And this shows, this illustration presents a key top-line result or results from the analysis, from the quantitative analysis. The bar on the left represents all of the data that is entered into electronic case report forms by investigative site personnel. The small yellow portion at the top is the portion of all of that data that actually gets corrected after initial entry by sites. And amazingly, it's only about 3.7% on average. And this analysis was conducted across close to 1,200 studies, all of them multi-site phase 2 or 3 studies that were contributed from at least 70 different sponsor organizations. So a very robust data set. The average is only a 3.7% correction rate. So that's a very compelling result in and of itself, which really indicates that it's an indication that there's a high level of reliability in the initial transcription by sites from patient source documents. Now, the bar on the right is a magnification of that 3.7%. And what we did in the analysis, we further broke down what the drivers of those corrections were. And you can see we broke it out into 3 distinct categories, SDV being one of them, EDC system checks, which is your auto queries in the EDC system that are interacting with the site as they're entering their data, and then all other reviews, and presumably a significant amount of those other reviews would be driven by clinical data management organizations, but also from medical safety reviews, from biostat and biostat programming reviews. So all of those other remote and centralized reviews. In particular, SDV's contribution, its impact on the overall data set is only slightly over 1%. So it really brings into sharp focus the minimal return that the industry is getting on the huge investment it's making in the practice of SDV. I think most estimates on in the industry converge on somewhere close to 15% of the total cost of clinical research globally can be attributed directly to source document verification, which is a significant amount of the effort that site monitors traditionally do in their on-site monitoring. What I'd also like to point out here is the EDC system checks. That represents close to 40% of all data corrections are driven by the auto queries and the EDC system interacting with the site to help guide their data entry. So it really shows the tremendous return that the industry is getting now from having transitioned from paper to electronic case report forms and EDC systems with those checks interacting with the sites, getting much better quality data at the initial point of capture. So it's particularly an important aspect, and I do have to make a plug. I'm so excited being at Omnicom. Our EDC system in particular is particularly advanced in that area in terms of driving highest quality data at the point of capture. But anyway, I'm going to pause and let Andy add his thoughts to this slide as well.
Yeah, I should point out that this data excludes batch-loaded data, so it doesn't. There's no batch-loaded data included here to dilute it. So this is pure data entered, and the only thing that I would bring up to question, we put a high number of queries are generated to generate a few changes. So I've been looking carefully at this over the past few months as to whether we should pull back on the amount of queries we actually do. Many queries are defensive queries or produce very few database changes or very few changes on critical data. And so it's not only SDV we should question our overall data cleaning process, right, in-house and on-site.
Yeah, I would agree with that. When you say queries, are you talking specifically about the auto queries, or do you mean also, manual data management queries as well?
But both sets need to be reviewed. Okay, auto queries are cheap for us. They're not cheap for site. And if we're trying to make the clinical trial process smoother, then we have to think of the workload that we create by creating queries on 15% of the data, which only change 2.6%.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with that. I would. My additional comment on that would be absolutely. We need to review the auto queries come very cheap. The return in general is very big, but they should be intelligently and thoughtfully implemented, so as not to be unnecessarily, producing a negative experience for the sites. I think that's part of the point you're making, Andy, as well.
Exactly.
So the other key result that came out of that analysis that Transcelerate published was, so it's that previous result was focusing on corrections to data that, after it's been entered by sites. But a very legitimate concern or question is, yeah, that's fine, but what about patient events, and particularly adverse events and serious adverse events? They could be entirely missed, not transcribed at all, and so that initial analysis wouldn't catch that. So we wanted to also investigate and come up with at least a quantitative estimate of the percentage of adverse events that appear to have been initially missed or not transcribed at all into the case report form, and then only entered after on-site monitoring. And the result we came up with for adverse events on average was a range, as you can see there on the left, 7 to 12% of AEs appear to only be entered following relevant on-site SDV activities by monitors. For SAEs, it's actually a much lower percentage, and you would expect that. SAEs are much more visible to the sites right up front, has a significant impact on patient care overall, and very, very tight reporting requirements on those, so you wouldn't expect those to be missed very often at all. What this tells me, and I'll let Andy comment as well, is that not that we should be doing 100% SDV of AEs and SAEs in a risk-based paradigm, but relatively speaking, the proportion of effort that monitors spend on site reviewing patient charts and doing SDV, a higher proportion of that should be focused on the safety reporting, on the AE and SAE reporting, because this represents a somewhat slightly higher risk that we've uncovered here with respect to missing events. Andy, your thoughts?
That's exactly. We've developed our own criteria within BI, as well as SDV and SDR. We have a subset called unreported event review, and if we find issues with adverse event reporting, low event reporting, or late reports, then that triggers the CRA having to do more unreported event review. It becomes a key risk. You don't have to do more SDV, you don't have to do more SDR. You can really focus your activities on what is key to the risk being shown.
Absolutely. Yeah, great point. So I want to pause again for just a minute and ask you, the audience, to take a shot at answering a second polling question related to RBM adoption barriers. And Andrew, I'm going to hand it over to you for that.
Well, great. Thanks, Steve and Andy, for that. We certainly have the second and final polling question appearing on audience member screens right now. This time the question is, what do you see as your organization's single biggest barrier to successful RBM adoption? And your options this time are fear of increased regulatory or audit risk, fear of potential degradation in quality, your third option, lack of team consensus on RBM value, and your fourth and final option, perceived complexity or burden of RBM implementation. All right, that question again, you can vote on in real time by clicking on your screen. I encourage you to do so for the second and final polling question. What do you see as your organization's single biggest barrier to successful RBM adoption? All right, most of you have voted, so I'm going to close polling now and share the results with everyone. And there we have it. 61% of you said perceived complexity and burden of RBM implementation. 23% of you said lack of team consensus on RBM value. 11% of you said fear of potential degradation in quality. And 5% of you said fear of increased regulatory and audit risk. And with that, I'll hand back the mic to you.
Now, those are very interesting results. From my perspective, I actually wasn't sure what to expect in terms of a breakout there, and I've noticed, and been directly aware over the past year or more, increasingly, that the stumbling block that most of you cited in your answer, which is perceived or actual complexity or burden, as your organizations, as your teams are looking to implement, put all the processes and methodology and tools in place for RBM. So it is consistent with what I've been seeing increasingly. But that's a quite strong response for that particular answer. Andy, anything to add there?
I think it goes along the lines of the difficulty in understanding what the word risk actually means. And there is great fear in the industry of the word risk, even though in the average protocol, I think we have it 90 odd times. Risk is whether there's going to be uncertainty in achieving your objective, and in trying to understand that, I can see why some people find that difficult to come to terms with. So I think we have to work on making it simpler.
Yeah, that's a great point, Andy. And I know you and I and some other colleagues have talked about that and in the past, and really lamented about the label given to this paradigm with the word risk as the first word, risk-based monitoring. Unfortunately, that train has left the station. The regulatory authorities are calling it risk-based monitoring. That's what they call it in their guidances. So, despite some nice attempts at folks to put different labels on it, I think we're stuck with risk-based monitoring, even though it gives a negative impression or perception to a lot of people. It's an accurate description of the methodology, but it's actually a paradigm that's going to improve quality and lower risk, not increase it. So, you know, right along the lines of the answer that you all provided about the complexity and burden, you know, as I said, we've been seeing that on an increasing basis as well. And, you know, what we're seeing is that a lot of organizations are well-intended, but unfortunately over-engineering a lot of key aspects of risk-based monitoring methodology and implementation in a couple of key areas during the planning process with risk assessment and development of a risk management plan, as well as operationally with implementation of, I would say sometimes dozens of key risk indicator metrics and quantitative analysis that they're finding as they go and try to do it is extremely resource intensive for each study and not really very scalable across the organization. The reality is, you know, from my perspective, and I believe from Andy's as well, is that it doesn't have to be that complex, and it really shouldn't be. And in fact, in most ways, the simpler you make it, the more effective and successful your organization is going to be. And yeah, we'll talk about a few tips and areas in particular where you should think about keeping it simple. Andy, anything that you want to add? And feel free to disagree with me on any of these points as well.
Of course, I'm happy to disagree. I think sometimes the complexity comes in because we address changes, we address the risk assessment late, and if you can't change the protocol, you're left with living with the risk and only monitoring it. And so if you've got a bad protocol, no amount of risk-based monitoring will actually save you. You've got to have the quality by design, the good protocol first, and then it's going to work through later. But keep it simple. We started off with risk reports that were generated in SAS and dumped down into Excel. It was Excel because it was an easy-to-use tool for all the monitors. We didn't have to train them in how to review the data again. They could just do it. So yeah, it can be simple.
Yeah, absolutely, and great point about starting with the protocol. You know, risk-based monitoring really is an extension and an adjunct to quality by design. And you know, starting with the protocol means you're assessing risk and trying to remove or mitigate risk in the protocol design itself, as Andy said. So that's a key starting point for your organization. You know, a few RBM keys to success that we want to talk about, really in general with a focus and a theme of simplicity, are around the area of the study risk management plan, or what Transcelerate calls the IQRMP, the Integrated Quality Risk Management Plan. Dynamic or targeted SDV plan, that's your partial or reduced SDV plan, and then centralized monitoring, and particularly you know, focus on ensuring that your key risk indicators are truly effective and not actually counterproductive. So, study risk management plan, there's a few key components to that. One, you know, first is an exercise called a study risk assessment. I've seen a lot of organizations, including some of the Transcelerate organizations, as they're going to implement risk-based monitoring, putting together templates and a process for study risk assessment that is honestly, in my view, well-intended but over-engineered, where there are many dozens of study attributes that they're doing that teams are being asked to assess for risk. And then, you know, including a fairly intensive and often vague to study team members quantitative process where there's 3 numbers that you have to assess for each study attribute. It's, for those who might be familiar, it's called an FMEA, or Failure Modes and Effects Analysis. Somewhat arcane, and in my view at least, misapplied to the situation, and another example of unfortunate over-engineering and over-complexity. The guidance that we give to our customers at Omnicom and the consulting we provide and templates has really pared that down and removed a lot of the unnecessary duplication and overlap, and provided a much more effective, simple, smart approach for doing an effective study risk assessment. It is important to do that, and it is important to put this risk management plan together, but it does not have to be a very burdensome process on top of everything else your study teams are doing during what's typically a very frantic study planning and study setup period. Critical data identification, of course, is another key component. Identifying the KRIs that you're going to use to detect those key risks emerging in your study, and putting an action plan around that. And then, of course, your targeted or dynamic SDV plan. Andy, anything that you'd like to offer in that regard?
Yeah, I don't like just having an SDV plan, because it focuses us back onto the old methods. We have an SDV plan, an SDR plan, an unreported event review plan, and we hope that the SDV plan will change by a minimal amount, because really we're focusing on what is a key impact, SDR. That drives a quality assurance process. SDV is really a quality control process, and picks out random errors.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. And in your experience and your planning, Andy, for your organization, how much more SDR source review are you doing than SDV? Is it a significant additional amount, or is it, how would you characterize that?
We drive it according to the issue seen. And so if we have transcription issues, we increase the amount of SDV. If we have protocol understanding issues, protocol violations, or delays in data entry, then we increase SDR. And if we have issues with late SAE reporting, underreporting of events, then we drive unreported event review. So each gets targeted. I'd say that there's still not full understanding in what good and bad source data is, as much as we like to think that, and I think we've got to do a lot more education on that.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Just a couple of words about dynamic SDV plans, and Andy, I agree with you very much. I think SDV should not be a primary focus. It is one type of review that should continue to be a part of the mix, but as our analysis showed, should be used very sparingly and in a very targeted way. One thing that I've seen is some organizations are looking at, as part of the planning, doing a site-by-site pre-study assessment and actually configuring a different initial SDV plan per site. My strong recommendation in this area is, again, with the theme of keeping it simple, probably in most cases it's not worth doing that. You may be spinning your wheels and doing a lot of extra effort to do that assessment and apply different SDV levels per site at the beginning of a study for very little value, if any. Instead, consider starting all sites, regardless of previous GCP experience or whatever, to the same SDV level, and only change SDV levels or increase SDV as needed based on actual observations during the study, as Andy was just alluding to previously. Are your site monitors able to optionally SDV? Part of that has to do with your EDC system and the features that support a targeted SDV plan. They should be so restrictive that your monitors can't optionally SDV forms as they see fit as they're reviewing patient charts on site. And I know that in some cases, implementations, the tools made available become overly restrictive in that area. Is SDV random sampling necessary? Again, I'm a proponent of keeping it simple. I don't really see a need for random sampling. This is just an illustration of what a standard type of implementation looks like for many organizations that I tend to agree with, and it's more of a tapering type of approach where you're doing a relatively larger amount of transcription checking maybe on the first subject or the first couple of subjects, and then significantly reducing that afterward. Andy, invite you to add your thoughts here as well.
Okay, my statistical hat goes on here, and I've got to say that as we're doing sampling, you should do it random. When we designed our system, we went back to the 1990 GCP documentation, which actually states that if you want to do a sampling method for monitoring on site, then you should do it random. So that was the basis of our system. But what we did is we designed a nice simple tool that would do that for us and could integrate it. So as long as you've got the tool to support it, use it.
Okay. All right. So there you have it, folks. You have two different perspectives on this. So very interesting. You will have to have a beer at some point, Andy, or two, and talk through that one further. I'm still not there yet. But
I'm there for the beer.
What's that?
I'm ready for the beer.
Me too. Okay, so let's talk about key risk indicators. I am a strong proponent of paring down and reducing the quantity of key risk indicators and focusing much more on the quality of the key risk indicators. In my view, you do not need many dozens of key risk indicators on any given study to effectively uncover key risks. And in fact, the more you have, on the other hand, is likely to actually lead to more issues and problems. You want to avoid duplication and KRI proliferation, both from a scalability perspective, just an overall operational management perspective. You don't want to have a lot of duplication where you have signals firing all over the place, where you're sending your site monitors and study team members on a lot of investigations for what turn out to be non-issues. That gets into the second bullet, KRI reliability as well. You want to minimize false signals. So when you're selecting your KRI, select only the core set, maybe 10 or 15, that cover the key risk areas identified in your trial. Then what's important is making sure that those are reliable, that they're not implemented in a way that produce a lot of noise, a lot of false signals that are going to send your site monitors off on chasing ghosts that turn out to be non-real issues. And then the other key area is early detection. You can implement metrics in a way to be lagging indicators that are retrospective. That's not what we want with risk-based monitoring. The whole point is to be able to detect emerging potential issues as early as possible so that you can investigate and remediate them before they become a larger problem. Get your sites on the right track, do the retraining or have the discussions as early as possible to make sure that you're driving quality through the trial. Andy, anything you'd like to comment on here?
I'd agree totally with the leading indicators. I think something that you can measure on every site is essential. An important protocol violation, they occur in probably 5% of the patients. They're not a good indicator. They're largely random. Okay, in one or two sites they're systematic, but it doesn't really help you. And I think in this area, if you want to get down to simplicity, it may require that you add 2 or 3 indicators together to drive your one monitoring metric. So add together late SAE reporting or the delay in SAE reporting, add together underreporting of adverse events or underreporting of key systemic adverse events. And by having all those 3 together, you'll always be able to produce a number where you can start to get better estimates. And
absolutely, yeah.
That will lead into it.
Absolutely, yep. Completely agree. Just one particular example with respect to reliability, and as Andy just said, as we indicated earlier, underreporting of adverse events is a key area of focus in centralized monitoring. And so, you know, AE rate is an important KRI in your centralized monitoring tool set. What I've seen, unfortunately, too many times, at least with initial implementations, that teams are calculating an AE rate, you know, very simply as the total number of adverse events at the site divided by the total number of subjects. So here's a hypothetical example. You've got 2 sites in the same trial. Site 101 has 5 subjects. Site 104 also has 5 subjects. However, the 5 subjects at Site 101 have been participating on average 10 to 12 months. The subjects at Site 104 only for a couple of months on average each. Well, you know, which site is going to have more adverse events across their 5 patients? Obviously, the Site 101. But if you do the simple calculation, just dividing AEs by subjects, you're going to get a drastically different rate at each site. And it's going to appear that Site 104 is significantly underreporting relative to Site 101. But is that really the case? Well, of course not. You have to be really thoughtful and make sure that you're, I'll use the math term, normalizing these rates to make them, you know, to enable a more reliable, consistent comparison across sites in your trial. So obviously, you have to take sort of relative follow-up time for subjects into account in this important calculation. Andy, do you want to add anything there?
No, you've really covered it. We also normalize as well as by exposure by region, as we expect differences between regions.
That's a great point, and I've actually done some quantitative analysis in the past of AE rates across regions, and indeed, what everyone expects is definitely true, that different regions of the world yield very different AE reporting rates for subjects. So that's a great point. That's the end of our slideshow.